Lesson 3, the growth of cities. Urbanization. The years from 1880 to 1910 were a time of spectacular population growth in the Pacific Northwest. Some places that were inhabited by Indians and an occasional trapper were transformed within a generation. They changed from small, rural, having characteristics of the countryside, communities, into urban areas or bustling cities with brick buildings, paved streets, trolley cars, and electric lights. In all of American history, there had been nothing quite like this. Nowhere was urbanization as rapid as it was in the state of Washington. Urbanization refers to the transformation of small communities into cities. Most of the urban population was found in the region's four largest communities: Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. By 1910, these four cities contained almost one-third of the entire population of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Tacoma and the Northern Pacific. Leaders of the Northern Pacific Railroad planned to run tracks from St. Paul, Minnesota, all the way to the harbors of Puget Sound. Company officers planned the route, knowing that wherever the tracks ended, there would be a tremendous growth and new business for cities along the route. Cities were often built up around train stations, especially cities that also had a seaport. Goods and raw materials such as coal, iron ore, lumber, and grain could be shipped from mines, mills, and factories across the country by rail and then shipped to other countries and cities on the East Coast by sea. People who rode the trains started businesses near train terminals. When Tacoma was chosen for the railroad terminal, the railroad company bought land cheaply, had it surveyed, and drew land plots. Tacoma's growth rate in the 1880s boomed. The world's largest sawmill, was built there in 1886. Then growth slowed. An economic slump in the 1890s was especially hard on Tacoma and opened the way for its rival, Seattle, to become the largest city in the state. A rival is a competitor or opponent. At this time, Seattle and Tacoma were intense rivals. Seattle. Seattle is one of the number of port cities on Puget Sound under consideration for the railroad terminal. However, the Cascades cut it off from the interior of the region. City residents fought hard to overcome such obstacles and bring the railroad to Seattle. At the time, Seattle's population was less than 1,200 people, and it was competing against larger, more established cities. Nevertheless, officials were confident their city would win. Toward that end, Seattle offered the Northern Pacific generous loan and land grants, including a 30-foot wide strip along the waterfront on which to build a train station. To the dismay of the city officials, the Northern Pacific Railroad chose to build the terminus, or the end point, in Tacoma. Eventually, Seattle boosters, who are energetic or enthusiastic supporters, were able to convince James Hill to build a train station in Seattle. At first, he was reluctant, saying that it was more important to Seattle to have goods delivered to it cheaply than to have a fancy depot. But after he bought the bankrupt Northern Pacific, which by then had built a small station on Railroad Avenue in Seattle, he agreed to build a station. The new King Street station, called the Union Depot at the time, opened in 1906. 5 years later, the Union Pacific Railroad built its own station, Union Station. The two stations are about a block apart. Although the two stations made Seattle residents proud, the city's crowning achievement became its successful promotion as the only gateway to the gold of the Klondike. The Klondike is an area in Canada's Yukon Territory, just east of Alaska, where gold was discovered in 1897. In addition to building the two train stations, Several ambitious engineering projects further contributed to the development of Seattle. An electric power system was created, a sewer system was constructed, and a water system suitable for a much larger city was developed. City leaders spent millions of dollars lowering Seattle's steep hills and leveling out land in the downtown area to facilitate growth and better transportation. Today, you can take an underground tour in the Pioneer Square area to see a bit of old Seattle. The Klondike Gold Rush. The discovery of gold in the Klondike region of Canada's Yukon Territory was an important event in Seattle's history. The city exploited, or took advantage of, the Klondike Gold Rush to gain the advantage over all of its rival cities. No American port was closer to Alaska and the main trains that led from there to the Klondike. When gold was discovered, about 1,500 people fled north on the first ship to Alaska, with 9 other ships crowded in the harbor waiting to follow them. Even the mayor of Seattle quit his job and went to the gold fields. Stores ordered in so much provisions that the merchandise was stacked 10 feet high in downtown Seattle. Each miner had to take about a ton of supplies with him, including tents, cooking pots, tools, winter clothes, and over 1,000 pounds of food. All the provisions were called an outfit. Outfits were sold in Seattle, so were hotel rooms, restaurant meals, and many forms of entertainment. Shipyards bustled with construction. All this meant a booming business for Seattle. Erastus Brainard of the city's Chamber of Commerce was directed to promote Seattle as the gateway to the Klondike, and he did. Brainard let loose on the United States and foreign countries a flood of advertisements and articles in magazines and newspapers. He wrote letters to government leaders, all promoting Seattle as a place for miners to buy their provisions and as the nearest seaport where miners could board a ship for Alaska and Canada. The frenzied result was a stampede. In fact, the crazed gold seekers were actually called stampeders. Stampeders took gunny sacks or woven bags to carry back the gold nuggets they assumed were just lying around. The truth was that less than half of the 100,000 people who left for the Klondike actually got there. The extreme cold and isolation of the Klondike was scary. Waterways froze solid. Miners faced blizzards, hikes across glaciers, and falls into crevasses off icy cliffs. In the warmer months, deep mud holes, floods, and mosquitoes made life miserable for man and beast. When the men reached the tops of the icy peaks with part of their provisions, they had to go down again and bring up another load. They repeated this process as much as 30 times. Finally, the town of Dawson City welcomed them at the edge of the gold fields. Anxious to begin finding gold, miners would find that the best claims were already staked. They sold their provisions to other miners for a fraction of what they paid, and they made their long journey home. A newspaper correspondent describes the arrival of the stampeders in Dawson. It is a motley throng, every degree of person gathered from every corner of the earth and from every state of the Union. Weather-beaten, sunburned, Australians with upturned sleeves and a swagger, young Englishmen in golf stockings and tweeds, would-be miners in mackinaws, raincoats, and rubber boots or heavy, high-laced shoes, Japanese, Negroes, and women everywhere. Some successful stampeders who returned to Seattle invested in local businesses. John Nordstrom invested $13,000 of his gold into a shoe store. A man he had met in the Klondike owned the store. That modest start was the beginning of the Nordstrom's department store chain. Edward Nordoff, a Seattle merchant who profited from the Klondike rush, turned his small store into the Bon Marché stores. The gold rush was not good for many miners, but it was very good for Seattle businessmen. New businesses meant more growth, and by 1910, Seattle was the largest city of the Pacific Northwest. Spokane. Spokane, first called Spokane Falls, was built next to the waterfalls of the Spokane River, so the city's first advantage was water power. The water power was used to run a sawmill and a flour mill to grind grain into flour. Then the water power produced Spokane's first electricity. After both the Northern Pacific and Great Northern Railroad lines came through, the city's growth seemed assured. Its location made it a transportation hub. Soon, branch rail lines linked Spokane to mining, timber, and agricultural areas. Spokane reaped the benefits when silver was discovered in Idaho's Coeur d'Alene region in the 1880s. People brought their new wealth from the mines and settled in Spokane. Silver from mines in Idaho and British Columbia provided the money to build many of the mansions in Spokane. Newspapers reported the rapid growth of Spokane and its impact on businesses and residents. These are quotes from local newspapers. I am today selling 4 times the quantity of merchandise to miners of which I disposed 1 year ago. I can scarcely order goods rapidly enough to meet the daily requirements. From the Spokane Review in 1890. My next stop was Spokane Falls, where I was greatly surprised to find the improvements that have been made there within 2 years. Electric lights, telephones, and other metropolitan conveniences are available. Every face expresses vitality. Every voice is cheerful, and everyone has a little money. From the Morning Review in 1886. Spokane Falls is well supplied with churches. It is a sure sign of peace and prosperity. People in the East always locate in a place where there are good influencers, whether they follow them or not. From R.P. Elliott in the Spokane Falls Review, 1890. The next step. Like the rest of the country, Washington's population increased as a result of this period of urbanization that was fueled by the railroads and immigration. Many of the new immigrants went on to play a large role in organizing labor unions and encouraging economic and political reforms, a topic that we'll cover in our next chapter.